Before you scroll, I want to ask you something. What if the same civilization that gave us philosophy, art, and democracy was also performing rituals so dark, even their own historians tried to destroy the evidence? Around 600 BCE, deep inside the marble temples of ancient Greece, men in robes gathered under torchlight, whispering prayers not to gods, but to desires they could never admit in daylight. They called them rites of purity, but what really happened inside those walls would break the souls of countless women and captives, all in the name of divine balance. Where are you watching from right now? Your room, your phone, maybe lying in bed? Because what you're about to hear isn't myth or legend, it's a chapter of history Greece itself tried to erase, the intimate rituals that turned worship into control. And before we step into that world of tortures, silence, and secrets, make sure you subscribe, because this is the side of history they never wanted you to see. The year was 700 BCE. The Greek world was rising, marble temples glowing under the sun, poets writing hymns to beauty, philosophers speaking of balance and reason. But in the shadows of those same temples, another story was being written. A story carved not in stone, but in silence. Archaeologists today still find traces, shallow pits beneath temple floors, symbols etched behind altars, fragments of poems that were deliberately scratched out. These weren't mistakes of time, they were erasures. Because somewhere between their worship of gods and their hunger for power, the Greeks discovered something terrifying, that devotion could be used as a weapon. Imagine a night without firelight, only the glow of oil lamps flickering on marble walls, the sound of drums echoing in caves, the trembling breath of a girl told she is chosen. Historians speak of democracy, logic, and enlightenment, but almost none speak of this. The hidden rituals that turned faith into submission, acts so intimate and brutal that even centuries later the records were burned, the witnesses silenced. What if the truth about the world's most civilized empire isn't glory, but guilt? Because long before Athens became a symbol of wisdom, its foundations were built upon fear, the kind that doesn't fade with time. Stay with me. What you're about to hear isn't myth, it's the forbidden side of ancient Greece, the story they buried beneath perfection. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The year was 700 BCE, the Greek world was rising, marble temples glowing under the sun, poets writing hymns to beauty, philosophers speaking of balance and reason. But in the shadows of those same temples, another story was being written. A story carved not in stone, but in silence. Archaeologists today still find traces, shallow pits beneath temple floors, symbols etched behind altars, fragments of poems that were deliberately scratched out. These weren't mistakes of time, they were erasures. Because somewhere between their worship of gods and their hunger for power, the Greeks discovered something terrifying, that devotion could be used as a weapon. Imagine a night without firelight, only the glow of oil lamps flickering on marble walls, the sound of drums echoing in caves, the trembling breath of a girl told she is chosen. Historians speak of democracy, logic, and enlightenment, but almost none speak of this. The hidden rituals that turned faith into submission, acts so intimate and brutal that even centuries later the records were burned, the witnesses silenced. What if the truth about the world's most civilized empire isn't glory, but guilt? Because long before Athens became a symbol of wisdom, its foundations were built upon fear, the kind that doesn't fade with time. Stay with me. What you're about to hear isn't myth, it's the forbidden side of ancient Greece, the story they buried beneath perfection. Now, let's go back to where it all began. By 600 BCE, Corinth's Temple of Aphrodite, Arania towered over the sea, its white columns glistening like truth itself. To travelers, it was the symbol of love and purity. To locals, it was something else entirely. Inside, at dusk, the air filled with myrrh and rose oil, the temple maidens were led in silence, girls taken from conquered villages, told that their service would please the goddess. They were bathed, perfumed, and crowned with olive branches. Then the doors closed. Ancient inscriptions from the 6th century BCE described nights of union, when the high priests reenacted what they called the meeting of God and mortal. The ceremony was supposed to renew cosmic balance, but it was nothing more than human desire wearing a divine mask. Those chosen were forbidden to speak of what happened inside. Breaking silence meant exile, or death. The punishment extended even beyond life. Priests threatened that the goddess herself would curse the tongue of any who revealed her sacred secrets. And so through fear and silence the rituals continued. Even as poets praised Greece as the birthplace of reason, its shadows were filled with cries no one was allowed to hear. By 580 BCE, a few dared to question the sanctity of these rites. Among them was Thales of Miletus, a philosopher who whispered that the gods need no flesh, only truth. His words travelled quietly through Athens, carried by students and scribes, but his writings vanished soon after, likely destroyed by temple authorities. In Delphi, strange disappearances began to stir fear among families of the temple servants. Some claimed the chosen maidens were sent to serve the gods forever. Others said their names were erased from the city rolls. Archaeologists later uncovered a broken oracle stone from this period. Carved into it was a single chilling line: "The goddess accepts the silence of the innocent." That sentence alone tells the story of a civilization trying to polish marble over its own darkness. But not everyone obeyed. Small groups of scholars started recording forbidden details in coded scrolls, hiding them in caves near Mount Parnassus. Those fragile records, preserved by accident, discovered centuries later, are the only reason we even know these horrors existed. By the end of the 6th century BCE, the first murmurs of rebellion were echoing across Greece. The people had begun to sense that the gods weren't angry, only the men pretending to speak for them were. And that realization marked the first crack in the facade of divinity, because once faith begins to question itself, power begins to tremble. What came next would expose the full weight of that trembling power inside the marble rooms where devotion turned into obedience, and obedience into suffering. By 580 BCE, the temples of Corinth, Eleusis, and Delphi had become secret chambers of power. Outwardly, they gleamed in the sun: pristine marble, golden statues, fragrant gardens. Visitors saw beauty. Only the insiders knew the truth. Each year, temple maidens were chosen, often girls as young as 12 or 13. Some were born to local families, many were captives from conquered villages. Their selection was presented as a divine honor, a chance to serve Aphrodite, Demeter, or other deities. But beneath this veneer, there was a ritual of control and fear. Priests examined the girls' physical and emotional traits, marking those who were most obedient, most fearful, or most easily molded. They were taught that resisting the gods or the temple would bring disaster upon their families, their homes, or even entire cities. Inscriptions from 550 BCE reveal that initiates were given elaborate ceremonies to strip away their previous identity. They were bathed in sacred oils, anointed with herbs, dressed in ceremonial robes, and isolated from the outside world. Every touch, every word, every gesture reinforced submission. The preparation was meticulous. Mental conditioning began long before the rite of union. Girls were taught to associate darkness with divinity, silence with safety, and obedience with immortality. They were warned that speaking to outsiders, even family, would provoke divine wrath. By the time the first night arrived, the initiates were ready, fearful, compliant, and entirely dependent on the temple hierarchy. What was framed as devotion had become a psychological trap, carefully calibrated to erase personal agency. At dusk, the doors of the temple would close. Torches flickered against marble walls, casting shadows that danced like spirits. The rite of union began. The ritual chamber itself was a work of manipulation. High ceilings, narrow corridors, and hidden alcoves amplified every whisper, every cry, every heartbeat. Aromas of burning herbs filled the air, designed to disorient the senses and heighten suggestibility. Drums or chanting created rhythmic tension, lulling the initiates into submission. Accounts from late 6th century BCE scrolls, rediscovered in fragments near Mount Parnassus, describe ceremonies that blended sacred symbolism with emotional control. The girls were told they were embodying goddesses, yet every command and touch reminded them they were powerless. Priests used a mixture of reverence and fear. Praise was intertwined with threats, comfort intertwined with pain. Each initiate was taught that their suffering was necessary to sustain cosmic balance. The temple became a microcosm of absolute power, where obedience was worship and rebellion equaled annihilation. What outsiders called devotion was actually systematic domination. By controlling the initiate's senses, the priests ensured that no memory of the ritual could exist without shame or terror. The fear of divine punishment silenced them before anyone else ever had the chance to. At dawn, the ritual ended. The initiates, exhausted and altered, were guided back to their quarters. They were told that the goddess had accepted their service, that their families would be blessed, and that the city owed them gratitude. But the truth was darker. The initiates were bound by oaths of silence, sometimes under threat of exile, mutilation, or death. Historians believe that some even faced social erasure, being removed from civic records as if they had never existed. By 540 BCE, whispers of rebellion had begun to circulate. Some maidens resisted in small ways, refusing certain commands or hiding fragments of evidence. But the temple hierarchy crushed dissent swiftly. Stories of punishment, public humiliation, isolation, or worse, ensured that obedience prevailed. What we know today comes from rare fragments of tablets and oral tradition preserved by sympathetic scholars. They reveal a chilling reality. The rituals were never about worship. They were about power. Control of bodies, control of minds, control of truth. And yet even in silence, these girls, these young women, left traces of resistance. Hidden symbols scratched into stone, subtle changes in ceremonial movement, even tiny coded messages passed among peers. These were the first acts of rebellion, a reminder that even in the darkest temples, human spirit could flicker like a candle in the wind. The next chapter will uncover the voices the priests tried to silence, the stories of those who lived through these horrors, and the faint echoes that survived millennia. At dawn, the ritual ended. The initiates, exhausted and altered, were guided back to their quarters. They were told that the goddess had accepted their service, that their families would be blessed, and that the city owed them gratitude. But the truth was darker. The initiates were bound by oaths of silence, sometimes under threat of exile, mutilation, or death. Historians believe that some even faced social erasure, being removed from civic records as if they had never existed. By 540 BCE, whispers of rebellion had begun to circulate. Some maidens resisted in small ways, refusing certain commands or hiding fragments of evidence. But the temple hierarchy crushed dissent swiftly. Stories of punishment, public humiliation, isolation, or worse, ensured that obedience prevailed. What we know today comes from rare fragments of tablets and oral tradition preserved by sympathetic scholars. They reveal a chilling reality. The rituals were never about worship. They were about power. Control of bodies, control of minds, control of truth. And yet even in silence, these girls, these young women, left traces of resistance. Hidden symbols scratched into stone, subtle changes in ceremonial movement, even tiny coded messages passed among peers. These were the first acts of rebellion, a reminder that even in the darkest temples, human spirit could flicker like a candle in the wind. The next chapter will uncover the voices the priests tried to silence, the stories of those who lived through these horrors, and the faint echoes that survived millennia. By 530 BCE, cracks had begun to form in the perfect mask of Greek sanctity. Whispers spread through market stalls, sailors' taverns, and city squares, stories of temple maidens who never returned, of ceremonies where the gods demanded silence. A fragment found near Delphi describes a slave girl named Melanthe, chosen at 14. Her story survived through coded verses etched onto a piece of pottery discovered centuries later. She entered as light, she left as shadow. The goddess took her name. Archaeologists now believe these coded poems were written by temple scribes who secretly documented forbidden truths. Some were loyalists who later broke under guilt. Others were outsiders horrified by what they witnessed. One fragment even mentions the Chamber of Breath, a sealed room beneath the Temple of Apollo. It tells of faint singing that continued long after the rituals ended. Whether these were hymns of devotion or cries of despair, no one can say. By 520 BCE, a handful of Greek thinkers began questioning the holiness of these practices. A philosopher named Pythagoras, then a young man traveling through the Aegean, wrote, "No god requires the humiliation of the pure." His note was erased from official texts, replaced with vague praise for divine mysteries. But that erased line became a quiet prophecy, because once voices begin to whisper, silence itself becomes fragile. By 515 BCE, resistance began to stir inside the temples themselves. Some maidens began leaving hidden marks, small carvings of birds, flowers, or stars on the walls of their chambers. Historians now interpret these as messages of identity, silent acts of defiance against erasure. A parchment found in Corinth refers to a circle of the unheard, a group of young attendants who secretly aided new initiates, warning them of the truth behind the rituals. They used coded gestures and symbolic chants to pass forbidden knowledge. One record, smuggled out by a sympathetic guard, describes how a maiden named Callianera refused to perform the final vow. Instead, she stood before the high priest and spoke the words, "If this is the will of the gods, then they are not gods." She was executed the next morning. Her body was never found, but her name, carved faintly into a temple column discovered in 1892, became a symbol among historians of courage in captivity. The priests tried to crush rebellion through terror. But rebellion doesn't die, it transforms. Songs began circulating among commoners, disguised as prayers, mourning those who were chosen by the gods but forgotten by men. By the end of the 6th century BCE, silence was breaking. The temples still stood tall, but inside their walls, the truth was beginning to rot. When Athens entered its golden age around 500 BCE, the city wanted no trace of these stories. Philosophers spoke of enlightenment, playwrights glorified the gods, and the rituals, they were rewritten as myth, rebranded as sacred mysteries, and celebrated in festivals like the Eleusinian Mysteries, where centuries of abuse were wrapped in layers of symbolism and secrecy. The surviving victims disappeared into legend. Melanthe became a spirit of sacrifice. Callianera turned into a cautionary myth. Their pain became poetry, their truth became metaphor. Greece built its legacy on beauty, while burying its guilt beneath it. By 480 BCE, almost every record of the old rites had been destroyed. Temples were rebuilt, altars rededicated. Yet beneath some of those same structures, archaeologists have found sealed chambers, walls stained with oil, fragments of bone, and inscriptions begging forgiveness from forgotten gods. The echoes of those lost voices still linger, not in official history books, but in the spaces between lines, the silences where truth hides. And perhaps that's the most haunting part. The civilization that taught the world reason, balance, and philosophy also perfected the art of erasing its own sins. But as every historian knows, what is buried eventually surfaces. And in the next chapter we uncover how Greece rewrote its past, cleansing its image while ensuring that the truth of these rituals would remain hidden for nearly 2,000 years. By 480 BCE, Athens stood as the shining symbol of progress. The Persian Wars had ended, art and philosophy flourished, and the world hailed Greece as the cradle of civilization. But behind that marble perfection, a quiet cleansing was taking place. Temple archives were sealed, scrolls referencing the old rites were burned under the pretext of purifying religion, statues of forgotten goddesses were recarved to represent virtue and fertility, instead of sacrifice and submission. The same priests who once commanded fear now became philosophers of order. They rewrote divine law to justify their past, teaching that the rites of purity were allegories, not actions. But archaeology tells another story. In Delphi, a buried chamber unearthed in 1897 revealed inscriptions deliberately scratched over with new texts praising Apollo's light. Underneath, faint etchings still read, "The darkness remembers." It was a civilization reinventing itself, cleansing memory like washing blood from marble. By 450 BCE, Greece had become the teacher of the world, yet every shining column, every statue of wisdom, cast a shadow. The philosophers of reason built their temples atop graves of silence, and so began the greatest illusion in Western history, that enlightenment was born without sin. The erasure was not just spiritual, it was political. As democracy spread across Athens, leaders realized that control of the past meant control of the people. By 440 BCE, the Council of Areopagus authorized the destruction of superstitious relics that contradicted official state theology. Any document that described forbidden rites was condemned as heresy or madness. Historians who questioned the official narrative vanished from record. The poet Aristion of Chios wrote of maidens turned into myths, warning that a city built on silence will someday hear its echoes. His verses were banned, his name erased from archives. Meanwhile, Athens declared itself the model of virtue to the known world. Philosophers like Plato and Socrates spoke of divine forms and purity of soul, never daring to mention the centuries of ritual degradation beneath their city's foundations. But small clues remained. In half-finished statues, cryptic verses, and myths like Persephone's descent into the underworld, which scholars now believe symbolized the ancient trauma of the chosen maidens. Greece had not just rewritten its history, it had reprogrammed collective memory, turning shame into mythology and pain into art. And through that transformation, the empire achieved something extraordinary and terrifying. It buried the truth so perfectly that the world forgot to question it for over 2,000 years. Centuries passed. Rome rose, fell, and carried Greek traditions into its own empire. Renaissance scholars later revived Greek ideals, painting them as symbols of light, beauty, and reason. No one spoke of the darkness. No one even knew it had existed. Then in 1892, a team of French archaeologists excavating near Corinth stumbled upon a sealed chamber beneath a ruined temple. Inside were broken vessels, bone fragments, and inscriptions that didn't match any known ceremony. One fragment read, "She served not the goddess, but the men who named her so." That discovery cracked open a silence that had lasted 24 centuries. Historians began re-evaluating the myths, the tales of sacrifice, purity, and divine service, realizing that beneath poetic language lay human suffering disguised as holiness. And today, as we look back at the brilliance of Greece, its architecture, philosophy, and art, we must also face its shadows, because every civilization, no matter how enlightened, builds its temples on something. For Greece, that foundation was not marble, it was obedience, fear, and silence. The same silence that still echoes whenever history chooses beauty over truth. So the next time you see the ruins of a Greek temple glowing in the sunlight, remember this: the stones remember what the world chose to forget. The stones remember what the world chose to forget. And maybe that's the real lesson of history, that truth doesn't vanish, it only waits for someone brave enough to uncover it. So if stories like this make you question what's been erased from our past, then don't let this be the last one you hear. Subscribe, not for algorithms, not for numbers, but because there's still so much buried beneath the pages of time, forgotten empires, lost voices, and truths powerful enough to shake the world we live in today. This was the horrifying, intimate rituals ancient Greece tried to bury from history. I'll see you in the next untold chapter of the past. Until then, listen closely, because history still whispers, even through the silence.